Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. My name is Travis Slagle. I'm the Clinical Director of the Evoke Therapy Intensives Program. I'll be your host tonight. Today is July 20th, 2022. Tonight's topic covers a wide range of issues related to parenting, child development, attachment, and counseling theory. And I'm excited to be able to share this with you guys and to cover for Brad while he's away. So to start, I'd like to tell you all a story. This is a story about my dog. His name is Oak. I adopted him when he was a year old. And when I adopted him, he would flinch when people reached out to pet him. He'd bark at strangers, desperately wanting to connect and to love and very needy. In preparation for this talk, I thought a lot about what it means to be good. And I'd like for folks listening to consider where this idea of goodness comes from and to consider what that might imply for how we parent, how we understand ourselves and what we're working on in our own therapy process. So when I adopted my dog Oak, something that kind of really dawned on me that has really kind of been close to home is, he got hurt. Somebody hurt him. And in his process of getting hurt, he got scared. And so he has a disposition towards anxiety. And when we think about this idea of kind of being good in our response to our own traumas and the experiences of the wounds from our childhood, I think about the way that my dog has adapted to be able to be a good dog. He's the best dog you can imagine. If you all are watching this webinar now, you can see he's the sweetest eyes. And something about him has made me kind of consider a lot about the clients that I work with in my therapy practice and a lot about my own work and understanding the need to be good. And in a lot of ways, when we think about, if you all have had a golden retriever, you know a lot about golden retrievers. They are very affectionate. They are very needy, prone to anxiety. And my dog fits all those criteria and more. And in many ways, like dogs, we all have kind of a genetic memory of fear and suppression in our lives. And we think about where golden retrievers and how they've been bred. They've been bred to please. They've been bred to be obedient. They've been bred to for submission. And thinking about how this concept shows up in our understanding of our relationship with our kids, what we aspire them to be good. In a lot of ways, in psychology, we think that we describe this idea of projecting our inability to accept our badness, to acknowledge our inadequacies and our fears and our insecurities, and we project that onto others, rather than making meaning and understanding about who we are and where that our fears and our insecurities come from. We oftentimes project it onto others. And so when I think about my dog Oak, and I think about his need to please, I understand that comes from generations of conditioning, a genetic memory, often called epigenetics, that we all have. If we all think about the genetic history of fear in our lives and how that unconsciously or unconsciously affects how we parent. And so when we think about, the idea of parenting and kind of the goal of parenting, the task of parenting, as Dr. Reedy would say, isn't to raise a good child or a good student or a good athlete or a good artist or a good person. It's to raise a self. And we think even just from the earliest days that a child is born, you hear kind of discussions around, are they, I have such a good baby. They're so easy to work with. And so I have a very difficult child. They're hard to work with. The idea of goodness and the reaction to the inability to metabolize our own badness, it infiltrates how we think about ourselves, how we think about our kids. It shows up in our school systems, and we carry that as an artifact of our history. And a lot of the work that we do in the intensives program, a lot of the work that we're doing out in the field with the kids, is to be able to help them to integrate a more whole sense of self, rather than, thinking in polarities, that there is either, a good or a bad version of me, but rather I can contain both. Um, so thinking about becoming a self and asking ourselves some important questions, like how is the need to be good contributing to the problem? The need to be a good parent, the need to get it right. Who taught this to us? Who were the relationships in our early development that told us that there were consequences for being bad? And what did that sound like? So often in my history, and I think many, many of us can relate to this, there is a lot of parenting through fear and guilt. We carry that as a historical artifact of child raising, and the construct of parenting through fear and consequences and punishments and rewards is built in so much of our social system. And yet what happens in the psychological experience of a child is that there is a deep feeling of inadequacy and fear and insecurity that can generate from living in a world where you are either a good child or a bad child. You're either successful or you're a failure. You're either somebody who is pleasing or somebody who is difficult. And so much of the challenges in our relationships with our kids comes down to the challenges with ourselves, and how we can manage our own emotional needs and our own anxieties. So it's important to ask, how often are we correcting the behaviors in our children? What does it sound like? What percentage of our time and our interactions with our kids are we, pointing out things that they're not doing, or things that they need to be doing, or things they haven't done well at? How often is that built into school systems and in grading systems, and how kids are being taught in many ways to perform for the adults in order to get the relationships and the connections that are so fundamental to their survival? So going back to the experience of my dog, his need to please is a survival mechanism. And we want to try to evolve out of raising children as pets, and being able to create an experience for a child to become a self, to become somebody in their life that is authentic and not, kind of wrapped in the guilt and the fear and the need to please the adults in order to, in some ways, pacify their anxieties. And this is where it gets very challenging, is that as adults, we're up against so many stressors and the challenges of our own self-care that makes it very, very hard for us to show up in that capacity to create a welcoming space, the secure attachment that craves an experience of being welcomed and an experience of feeling okay. Think about that for a second. The idea of being able to create an environment, create an emotional container for a child to grow into, where they experience a feeling being welcomed and they experience a feeling of being okay. And part of the feeling of being okay is the parent feeling okay. When we are operating from a place of fear, when we're operating from our own guilt, when we have our own emotional needs that we have suppressed, the consequences is that we are projecting that into our relationships with our kids. So how do I process disapproval and rejection in myself? Where am I trying to get those needs met? That is the question for many of us, not only in our relationship with our children, but relationships with our spouses, with our coworkers, and ultimately the relationship with ourselves, where we are hoping to be able to have greater capacity for self-love and compassion and understanding where these unconscious needs and projections come from, without judgment, without a need to critique it or to live in a space of shame and regret. But there is an understanding that the ways that we are reacting comes from a place that makes a lot of sense. So there is a trauma story that is called love. And it is important for us as parents to be considering the difference between love and anxiety, and how, the need to protect and the need to control, the need to be able to prevent potential negative outcomes is getting, the narrative is that's a loving response. And what we want to try to encourage folks to be able to experience is that love is a giving experience. This is what Brad talks about in his book, The Audacity to Be You, is the idea that love is a giving. It's giving a space to be a mess, to not have the answers, to not get it right, to be bad, to be good, to be both, to be whole. So this is a book that I highly recommend for folks if you're interested in learning about intergenerational trauma. It didn't start with you, how inherited family trauma shapes who we are and how to end the cycle. And one of the quotes from that book is, sleeping inside of each of us were the fragments of traumas too great to be resolved in one generation. And to consider that, you know, the healing that we're doing in our work with our therapists, and if folks are out there thinking about doing their own work, you know, this is not just a service to our kids. This is service to generations before us and generations ahead of us. You know, oftentimes, you know, you hear that concept of doing what is best for the 7 generations from now. It's an old Native American prophecy. And what we want to try to do is to create that sentiment in ourselves that what we're doing, and understanding the anxiety and the fear of being bad, the fear of getting it wrong, the fear that, you know, my beautiful dog Oak, you know, shows up, and his loving, needy desire to please, his lack of self in a lot of ways, you know, that we can repair that in our human experience, and we can show up in those difficult moments and learn to love the dilemma that the people in our families are experiencing, rather than trying to control or to fix it. So I wanted to introduce a vicious cycle that I see often in the clients that we work with. And it starts at a very early age. And in some ways you could say that this is the epidemic that is happening for many of us in modern society. And that starts with this experience where love and acceptance is conditional. And Dr. Gabor Mate talks about, you know, the idea of a child sacrificing their authenticity for attachment, that the attachment need and the need for authenticity, they are in tension with each other so often in life. If I'm myself, if I am my authentic self, then my parents will be frustrated. If I'm my authentic self, my teacher will not give me the approval that she's giving the other students in the class. And so from a very early age, we're hearing that there are good behaviors and there are bad behaviors. There is ways that we are pleasing and the ways that we are frustrating. And so what takes its place in that moment is a lot of anger, sadness, loneliness, and fear. And those emotions, again, getting out of the mindset that there is a good emotion and there is a bad emotion, those emotions themselves are completely just and valid. What often happens is that we're not really prepared or taught how to feel them. And we have a very difficult time allowing and helping our kids learn how to feel those emotions, and oftentimes having those emotions about us as parents. And so the difficulty then is that we oftentimes meet those emotions with a negative bias. There's nothing to be scared of. You're overreacting. That's your anxiety talking. You should look on the bright side. And so those messages, while we think we're being helpful, we think it's a loving response, it's our anxious response. So it generates more shame, it creates more negativity, which then leads to an experience of either I have to live with this, you know, oftentimes impossible, you know, shameful experience, or I learn to suppress it. I learn to numb it, and I learn to project it. So rather than allowing myself to feel these very critical and oftentimes destructive emotional experiences, they get internalized and oftentimes projected into our relationships with others. So rather than doing our own work and moving through the fear, moving through the shame, moving through the anger, it gets stuck inside. And then that stuckness projects into the systems of our family. And then that again generates more anxiety, more rigidity, more need for control, the need to be good, the need to be right, the need to push and challenge others to think and feel the same way that we think and feel, which is in psychology terms, a lack of differentiation, often called enmeshment, sometimes even codependency. Again, the response to that builds another tension that needs to be resolved. And so that leads to another kind of manifestation of parentification of the child, where the child is now responsible for taking care of the needs of the parent, or a codependent relationship with the child, where there is no separation from self and other. And this cycle continues and continues and continues until we can disrupt that pattern, make meaning out of the emotions that are stuck inside of us. This intergenerational history where we were told that there is a certain side of the street that is good, and a certain side of the street that is bad, and we're constantly being critiqued and reminded and corrected when we're veering onto the other side of the street. And again, leading to lots of hypervigilance, lots of anxiety, lots of frustration, depression, a lack of identity that has the resiliency of self-love and self-acceptance. So the symptoms of needing to be good oftentimes sound like justifying, arguing, proving. A lot of times when I am in process with families, you'll hear the need to explain boundaries, trying to convince the child, or vice versa, the child trying to convince the parent why they're right, why their boundaries make sense, and why they should believe and agree with them. This idea of sculpting children so often, and I am definitely somebody that started off with my first child thinking if I read enough books, if I did enough of my own kind of self-development and learned kind of the right way to help my children, that I could shape them and kind of help them become a certain version of me, or a certain version that I thought would be more acceptable and more successful in life. And that is a doomed mission. This idea of being our children's sculptor is going to lead to a lot of anger. We do not want to be sculpted by another person. We want to be allowed to be ourselves. The next thing to consider is trying to make a child feel a certain way and being uncomfortable with their emotions. And so the idea of getting them to feel happy, to feel loved, to feel something that is more palatable, because allowing our kids to be scared, to be afraid, to be lonely is oftentimes anxiety for us as parents, to sit with their dilemmas, to sit with their pain. So the solution to this is owning our own limitations, reaching out for support, finding a therapist, going to a support group, doing our own work, making meaning out of our limitations, and where it becomes difficult for us to accept the mess that's in our lives, to accept the mess that our children are creating. I oftentimes run into this issue when I'm walking around in my living room and I'm stepping on a Lego, or I'm sitting in a counseling session and I can hear my kids playing on video games from downstairs. Or I just today, when my son walked into a session into my office, this experience for me is hard. I understand my own limitations when I want to be patient with them, and there are certain moments when I don't have it. So it is my responsibility, not my child's, to go and seek a place where I can do better self-care. I can take care of the need. I can be able to kind of come back with more capacity to express my boundaries, express my limits in a way that isn't shaming or controlling of my child. So here's a funny example, the new us having an old moment. And in this this picture, there is a mom and a dad who are standing over their son or child saying, "Don't you realize, Jason, that when you throw furniture out the window and tie your sister to a tree, you make mommy and daddy very sad?" For a lot of time, for many years as a therapist, starting out when I was working in wilderness and I was working in residential, my impetus was to have parents tell their kids how they feel. That was the standard practice. I didn't know any different. And the parents felt great. And the child potentially would kind of have a conscious or unconscious choice to either appease, I'm sorry, you're right, I shouldn't have done that. I'm really sorry for letting you down. I disappointed the family. I'm going to try harder. I won't let you guys down again. I feel so guilty and ashamed. I'm going to try harder now. And you can hear the messaging. There is an idea that the bad object is what we talk about in attachment therapy. rather than making sense of our emotions separate from our children and coming back to them and saying, it's not okay. I'm not okay with this. Um, our boundary is fill in the blank. And it doesn't have to be tied to you're scaring me, you're disappointing me, what were you thinking, how could you? All of those messages, again, projecting our struggle, our own badness onto them, the feelings of embarrassment, the feelings of impatience, the feeling that we're not showing up as our best selves. So rather than making sense and working on that in ourselves, the unconscious mechanism is to project that frustration into our children, and they internalize that as something being wrong with them, when most of the time it's just our own limitations. So boundaries are so essential in relationships. The secret ingredient of relationships is two parts. One is boundaries and the other is empathy, and it's equal parts. And oftentimes we can lean heavy on one side or the other. So examples of parenting with the self can look like being willing to be wrong, being willing to be the bad object, to be blamed. When my son walked into my session today, he said, well, I earned my video games today. And he felt it was unfair for me to take him away. And so I'm the bad object. I'm the mean parent who took away his video games that he feels entitled to. And my need to argue with him, my need to lecture him, my need to kind of scold him about how disruptive and how frustrated I am about him disrupting my session is my emotional needs being projected on him, when ultimately the message is it's not okay to do that, and you can't have your video games. Being willing to lose is, and that might be unfair for you. I can, like you believe that you're entitled to that, and you may very well be so, but I can't give them to you today. You lost your video games today. Being able to stop making it about you. This is a critical aspect in all of our lives, in our relationships with others, is that we oftentimes are getting caught up in a difficulty of separating what are my emotional needs and what are the emotional needs of the person I'm in relationship with. And in understanding that your child's reactions, their feelings and successes and failures are not about you. They're their own unique, autonomous being coming to life in this world. And our responsibility is to make sense of who we are, to discover ourselves in this life, so that we can create space for healthy differentiation and separation from myself and my children, so that they have the space and the freedom to become who they are in this world. And this can sound like I may be wrong, I may be stupid, I may be unreasonable. And Brad would often say, I might be an idiot, but this is what I need. That's a very different sensibility in talking and sharing our boundaries than it being an argument, a battle, and a need to be a right or a wrong, to win the whose boundary is more true than the other, versus this is what I need. This stuff is hard work. A lot of what I'm talking about right now might sound simple, but in practice, this is some of the hardest stuff we can do in our lives. This goes against generations of conditioning, a lot of common thought in our world, a lot of projection of the badness that we see in media onto others, the divisiveness in our politics, so much of our inability to metabolize our own insecurities, our own kind of resistance to making sense that there is badness and goodness in each of us, oftentimes leads to so much conflict, dysfunction, and pathology. So as an intensives therapist, one of the beautiful things that we can offer is a space and time to dive into this work where you can get beyond the 50-minute session, give you a spaciousness to make sense of where these reactions and these patterns and this way of thinking comes from, with the capacity to contain it with love and compassion. to remove the space of resentment and judgment and contempt, and to make meaning that, our most dysfunctional patterns are coming from a place where there is a fundamental need and a valid need. And oftentimes when we talk about oppositional behavior, or we talk about distracting or disruptive behaviors, there is a need that is trying to be met. And so the question to ask is, what problem is this behavior trying to solve? And in an intensive, we have 20 to 36 hours over a course of multiple days with 2 therapists in the room to move you through many, many different activities and ways to make sense of what's going on in your own relationship with self and your relationship with others. It's one of the greatest gifts I can offer somebody in my work. And what we're seeing more and more now is this narrative of the next generation. Growing up in the days of of Disney, when there was a good witch and a bad witch, and now you can see even in the play Wicked, where you hear this sentiment: I was good and bad, but never wicked. You can see it in the Pixar movie Inside Out, where you see these parts of self being given a role in the story, where each has a piece that is good, that has what you would describe as joy, and you have sadness, and both have equal kind of roles and purpose in our own internal kind of constellation of how we experience the world. And so we are moving out of the black and the white thinking of our early narratives, and looking more deeply at what has been spoken about for thousands of years. Joseph Campbell would talk about the journey of the hero's journey, and battling with these parts of who we are, that these archetypal kind of journeys into confronting a dragon is really about confronting the parts of ourselves that have been suppressed and rejected, and leaning into them, finding space to be able to have more acceptance of these different parts of self. And this is the new generation of more inclusivity and how we understand ourselves and how we hope to be able to understand each other. So I'd like to share this beautiful quote by Ram Dass, which really speaks to the heart of this topic. And he talks about thinking beyond polarities. And he says a lot of people try to counteract the I am not good enough with I am good enough. In other words, they take the opposite and they try to invest it. That still keeps the world at the level of polarities. The art is to go behind the polarities. So the act is to go not to the world of I am good to counteract I am bad, or I am lovable as opposed to I am lovable, but to go behind it to I am, I am, I am. This includes the fact that I do crappy things and I do beautiful things, and I am. I love the sensibility to consider that this way of thinking, it gets out of the realm of trying to solve emotional problems with these external solutions, but it's an internal experience. I often say, an internal problem requires an internal solution. And so often in our life, in our culture, we are conditioned to look for external solutions. It's built into our social fabric to find a quick fix. Often this looks like control. This looks like rigidity. This looks like judgment. Black and white thinking that gets back into the, this is good and this is bad, this is right and this is wrong, to the I am, I am, I am. I contain enough space inside to hold both truths. That when I'm working with couples in high conflict relationships, a space to be able to hear each other, to understand and experience that there are two truths in the room, not one. And to find a space for curiosity and understanding each other's truth. So a lot of this work comes down to parenting not just our children, but ourselves. And so we talk a lot about parenting the inner child, especially in our work in intensives. Parenting the inner child is coming back to this oftentimes isolated and rejected part of who we were and who we still are today, and allowing them to have a voice, allowing them to have love and understanding and a space to be heard. And so Dr. Reedy would say, we must heal, repair, and reparent the child in us in order to accomplish the most critical tasks in parenting. So oftentimes as parents, we get wrapped up in crisis. We get wrapped up in such a pace of life where it's very hard to slow down. It's very hard to be able to pay attention to these automatic responses that are happening inside of us. And so the journey of reconnecting to that child that's inside of us, of allowing them to come out from their shell, come out from their hiding, come out from their, off maybe even prison sentence, and to come back into a place where they are free to be seen, to be heard, to be able to be given a voice that was, for whatever reason, told it wasn't welcomed, it was too difficult, it was too needy, it was too much, it was too difficult, it was bad. Either these messages were explicit or implicit, but the outcome is the same. It leads to suppression of our authenticity, a lack of connection to our own intuition, the ability to set boundaries and to do it in a way of love and understanding versus anger and judgment and rejection. This is the journey of reconnecting to those parts of who we are. And when we think of connecting to parts of self, there is, a lot of different talks about in psychology about parts work. Internal family systems is one of them. And they use, these archetypal concepts that there is an exile in each of us. And sometimes this exile is described as the wounded child. And the exile can be associated with lots of different behaviors and ways of responding and reacting to the stressors in our lives and the crisis and the critical parts of that push our limits. And so the exile is oftentimes dissociative, tends to isolate, prone to depression, feeling fragile, vulnerable, unlovable, unwelcomed, maybe misunderstood, undervalued, that something is inherently wrong with them. So the wounded child has to go and find a place away from everyone where they can't be hurt. Another part of self that's often described as the manager. This may also kind of be synonymous with the ego in some ways. Some would describe that all of these kind of parts of self kind of operate as the ego. There's different personality characteristics to these, our own survival mechanism inside of us. But the manager gets a lot of attention. It gets a lot of the control of operating the operational system in our lives. It's often over-functioning. It can be controlling. It can be pleasing. It can be overachieving. Underlying a lot of those behaviors is a lot of anxiety, mental rigidity, manipulation, difficulty in being able to allow the exile, that wounded child that's in us, to come out, to have a conversation, to allow their emotions to be heard. The manager is really there to try to kind of help to suppress in some ways, and to manage the emotional difficulty in our lives, often through performing. And in some ways, when we talk about, the myth of being good is kind of what gives birth to the manager, because the manager is here to perform and to get the approval. And it does it through a lot of desperate attempts. And it can sound like the critical parent, the voice of a critical parent that's inside of each of us. Either it's a literal adoption of the voice we heard from our own parents, or it's the critical parent that is the voice of society. that is constantly nitpicking and judging and critiquing and analyzing. It's when we hear that voice of getting in our heads. That's the critical parent. That's the voice, and that's the function of the critical parent. Lastly, is the firefighter. This is where, oftentimes, the exile, the manager isn't the one that, brings us into therapy. The firefighter, the one that is trying to manage the emotional heat of our difficulties. And so the firefighter is there to numb. It can look like self-harm. It can look like substance use. It can be binge eating, gaming, screen addiction, sexual acting out, anything that is designed to be able to manage unwanted emotion that feels too much, that emotion that's overwhelming. When Dalai Lama was interviewed about addiction, he was asked about addiction, and his response was that we are all addicts. We're all addicted to distraction, was what Dalai Lama said. And so when we think about this loyal soldier that's in each of us is fighting a battle. And it's a battle that's emotionally driven, to be able to sustain all this emotional tension that's inside of us. And so we crave things. We're impulsive. And that firefighter is there to try to, in many ways, to suppress and to manage unwanted emotion. And so when we think about these parts of self, we can start to have a dialogue with these different parts of who we are. And in an intensive, we might even do a role play. We might do an expressive art assignment where we actually kind of can hear the adult self speak to the younger self. We can hear the manager talk with the firefighter, or the wounded child to communicate with the loyal soldier. These are all different kind of generalized ways of introducing the concept of integration, a whole and integrated self. Most often the goal in psychology is an integrated self, not a fragmented self, not a fractured self, not a self that needs to be good, but a whole self. And I believe there's a quote that later down in this presentation where Carl Jung would say, I would rather be whole than be good. And so again, it comes back to changing the way we think, thinking about these different parts of who we are. So Albert Einstein would say, we can't solve problems from the same kind of thinking that we use to create them. And so the task in many ways is less about getting skills to manage the problem. Again, going back to that manager part of who we are, but an ability to make sense of all these parts of who we are, and to not give all the control and the power to one part, but each part has its equal say. Each part has a project to do, a task. If you think about it as a board meeting, and you have a company to run, and this company is your life, and each employee is a part of you. And each employee has an agenda. Each employee has a way they think the company should be run. And in many ways, therapy is about taking charge of the meeting and allowing each of these different parts of us to have a place and to have their own boundaries, so that one is not taking over and one is not being rejected and isolated, but we can be able to contain all of it. So one of the challenges in this journey of thinking differently, of making sense of this myth of being good in our lives, is that we're going to have to learn how to be the bad parent. And in The Price of Privilege, the author says parents have to be able to tolerate their children's disappointment, their resentment, and even their anger when their wishes aren't granted. A routine theme among parents of distressed teens is their inability to tolerate their child's unhappiness. So this reminds me of a story when we were in a lot of transition as a family, and my son said to me, Travis, if we have to move, it's going to be your fault. He said, Dad, if we have to move, it's going to be your fault. And I remember that hurt. Something about the circumstances of us having to move several times, and the culmination of all the other stressors going on in my life, that was a hard one to hear. I had to tolerate that in that moment, I needed to be the bad parent. And it was, and my response in that moment was, you're right. It will be my fault, and we'll work through it. And I think about how different that response might have been if I was speaking with my father, or if my father was speaking to his father. And that way of having a different response, a different way of thinking that allows us to have a different response when we experience the disappointment in somebody, of the coming towards us from somebody that we love, the frustration, the resentment, the anger. It all hits the buttons of our early conditioning, the voice and the kind of the voices of our early kind of attachment experiences that told us there was a need to be good, and there was a fear of being bad, and there was consequences for being bad. And oftentimes those consequences were rejection and a lack of relationship. So this way of thinking is a lot about helping us make sense of our reactions, our fears, the challenge of what it feels like to be the bad parent. Not just the intellectual concept of being the bad parent, but the idea that this is going to hurt. And how do we move through that pain with greater courage and capacity to show up without needing to be right? And I think about that moment that I shared with my son. If I would have said something along the lines that would have been maybe a voice from my history, how could you speak to me that way? Don't you see all the sacrifices that dad is making right now? You're so ungrateful. Thinking about the difference of, you're right, it will be my fault, versus, how could you say such a thing that is so disrespectful? Don't you see how much sacrifice I'm making for this family? You should be more grateful for what I do for you. Think about the feeling that creates. So the critical task in parenting is understanding, what is my project? And the project is repairing who we are, repairing the authenticity that had to be abandoned in order to maintain our relationships with our attachment figures. I couldn't be my full authentic self because I risked the disappointment and the judgment and the anger of the adults in my life. And I believe that may be true for many of us. And so there was a certain version of ourselves that was accepted, and there's a certain version of ourselves that was not. And our job in therapy is to repair the self. And the task oftentimes in parenting is to discover who we are, is to discover that whole story, all the ins and outs of how that was shaped and where that comes from. And in our discovery of ourselves, we have a capacity to have a different response. And to consider that without a self, the parent and the child won't know their limits. So becoming a self in parenting means that the child will have to learn to live with another that's limited, another that has badness, another that makes mistakes, another that has the capacity to say you're right, versus needing to prove that the other is wrong. So living with an other will bring critical lessons. One is distress tolerance. So often, there's this sentiment of like, my child needs, emotional management skills. So I send them to emotional management, therapy or DBT skills. And I love DBT skills. I think they've done amazing work for many, many people out there, but it's the understanding of who we are that gives us the motivation to use them. So often I've worked with young people who could teach DBT classes, but they have no sense of who they are that allows them to use those skills. So the discovery and the repair and the connection to who we are creates the foundation to use distress tolerance skills. And in that journey, we learn to feel our emotions. We learn to understand what emotions are. We learn to accept that there are no bad emotions. And that builds the emotional intelligence to be able to allow ourselves to feel what we feel and to allow others to feel what they feel. It's a beautiful journey when we can experience our capacity to have more range for empathy in our lives, to be with our kids when they are hurting and when they are angry and when they are disappointed, and to still have boundaries. It is not our project to fix it, to solve it, to lecture, to make them understand what it's supposed to mean in their lives. It's just a process of being able to have empathy and boundaries and the experience of delayed gratification, that it takes time to be able to metabolize these experiences. And it takes time when there is a boundary and when another is limited, and you're not going to get that immediate need met. When our desires to please, or our need or our desires for others to please us no longer is satisfying. And what's more satisfying now is the experience of authenticity in our lives. So again, going back to that quote by Carl Jung, I'd rather be whole than be good. And so I wanted to share some lessons learned the hard way in my practice with clients. And I would say even more so than practice with clients, this is something that I've learned the hard way for myself. Number one is your emotions are your responsibility. Oftentimes there is the phrase, "You made me feel sad. You made me angry." Even in that language, the semantics matter. It's making the other person responsible for their emotions. You can say, "I feel angry when you took away my video games." And oftentimes it's our job. What can I do to support you and manage in working through that anger? How can I help? And maybe even the phrase "working through that anger," it's just, maybe even rephrasing that. Just say, "How can I help you feel that more in a way that's loving and supportive for you?" So again, allowing others to feel their emotions is the greatest way to help them, in a lot of ways, evolve through them. We have to go through the door of our emotional experiences, and so much of life is showing us, distractions and avoidant patterns to try to convince us we can work around them. And this leads to number two. Our need to work around them comes from a place that makes a lot of sense, is that we're going to have to learn how to grieve. And some of these emotions are going to feel unbearable. Some of these emotions are going to hurt beyond our imagination. So the question for us is, are we willing to move through them, to look for opportunities to learn how to feel our sadness, how to feel our loss, how to experience our anger, how to be able to make sense of denial and bargaining, and to truly kind of embody what acceptance of something so painful might feel like. We're going to have to learn how to grieve. And what we resist persists. So, it's likely that some might say, "Hey, I'm not going to sign up for the learning how to grieve class today." That experience will persist. It will reveal itself again and again and again. And oftentimes the lessons that we're refusing or avoiding or resisting comes back in larger form, sometimes in more intense, unavoidable crisis moments. So what we resist does persist. Boundaries are for you and limits are for others. This is a beautiful, simple concept, but it can take a lifetime to understand and master. That my boundaries are to take care of me. They're about my needs. I'm not comfortable with marijuana in my house. The neighbor down the street might have a different boundary, but for me, that's my comfort level. Limits are for others. Violence is not acceptable in our home, and there's a limit around violence to protect the people in our house. So when you think about limits, oftentimes these are much more immediate dangers, almost thinking about a stop sign. This stop sign is to protect the general public. So there's a difference there. Boundaries are for me, limits are for others. And I would be very, very cautious about, using limits as a form of a more authoritarian version of boundaries. Limits are really about safety, immediate danger and safety. Growth is uncomfortable. There's oftentimes in the work that I've done with young people, this concept of the growth zone. The growth zone is not the comfort zone. And we don't typically grow in our comfort zones. We grow where we're challenged. We're not in a crisis, but we grow where we're feeling a degree of discomfort that allows us to still be able to function and to talk and to be able to communicate our needs. Empathy and boundaries is a safe relationship. So these are the two ingredients for a safe relationship. And thinking about curiosity. Curiosity is so important in our ability to listen, in our ability to show up in relationships. And it is the antidote to judgment. And oftentimes curiosity can be the antidote to anxiety. So looking for opportunities to try to expand our capacity to want to learn, to not have the answers, to resist the urge to be right, and learning to speak to our fears and our anxieties, which is number 9, versus avoiding them. Speaking to our fears and anxiety, again, going back to these parts of self. These are parts of who we are. And if we can personify these emotional experiences, we can have a dialogue. We can understand what they're trying to communicate, where they're coming from. And again, all healing is self-healing. This is all an understanding of how do I make more capacity to feel my emotions, to communicate my needs, and to show up with more grace and understanding for the messiness that life inherently is. And the last piece I wanted to put out there is that most solutions are part of the problem. When I say that, it's oftentimes the creating expectations around control, that the DBT program is going to solve it, that I don't need, it's my, the identified patient is the construct where it's my child's work, not my own. So the solution is for them to go get help, and that's going to solve the problem. Most solutions are part of the problem. So I'm so hopeful that there's somebody out there that might be interested in joining us for an intensive. It's one of the greatest gifts that I can imagine for ourselves and for the people that we love. We have upcoming dates. I believe there is one more intensive opening in the upcoming August 10th through 14th. We have, I believe, 2 more spots for the August for the online program. That's August 26th to 28th. We have several spots open for September. October is still open, but these programs are filling fast. And Dr. Reedy will be facilitating a Returning to You, which is an intensive for our alumni in October 12th through 16th. This is a therapeutic accelerator for folks to be able to dive into a lot of the concepts and ideas that I was talking about today, and to discover more of those parts of themselves that allows them to show up with a greater container, an open container for the people in their lives and for themselves. One of the quotes from the recent intensives, I wish I had done this years ago, when I thought I was dealing with it and therapy was for the offender and the hurt party that couldn't handle it. Now I see that working on me and changing my responses are the only hope I have to help others I love. Such a beautiful statement. If you are interested in doing a deep dive into your own personal work, you can reach out to us at intensives@evoketherapy.com. You can also reach me at my email is travis@evoketherapy.com. We have attachment-focused coaching that's also available. It's telehealth that's available throughout the world. Some of the best therapists that I've worked with, and I've been in this field for a long time. I'd love to be able to get you the support that you need to be able to do your own personal work and to enhance the therapeutic progress that you've already made. If you are interested, we also offer pursuits and hybrid intensives that allow for families to have a little bit more therapy light, This is a customized experience. We recently did one where family came out and did whitewater rafting in the mornings, and we did 3-4 hour sessions in the evenings. This is in our beautiful bed and breakfast, 10,000 square foot home. Everybody has a private room, beautiful space to be able to reconnect and do your own personal work. It has been a joy to be able to share this with you all. I did my best to be able to cover for Brad. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us at intensives@evoketherapy.com. And if you have any questions, Malia, who is with us, will save those questions and be able to post them in the next Q&A broadcast. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you in the future.